As we turn attention to the institution and the role, the inner dialogue, and the dialogue between the participant body and the high facilitator body. The inner dialogue, the state of development of the pattern of individuals that make up the high participant group, determines what role is acceptable for a facilitator to play in other words, you and we, the participant, create the garden that determines which kind of facilitator is able and willing to grow in that environment. And one of the things that emerges out of the garden of a culture of children in which myself and a majority of our culture consist of psychological children and adolescents in grown bodies looking to the parental figure to take care of us, to fix the problems, to soothe the wound, to love the unlovable, to alleviate the shame and guilt. In other words, abusive parents heaped on fear, trauma, shame, guilt, and failed to embody the symmetry of masculine and feminine energy, the emotional literacy, the attunement and regulation to the small one, to such a degree that the small one stayed small, could not digest that energy. And having been given an undigestible mass that walled us in at a given age, unable to break through, we then look for the parental figure, the one who promises to lift the weights to a level where we can breathe. A child does not like to see the imperfection in the parent because it bodes ill for the odds of the child's survival. A child, psychologically or physically, is in a dependent state. And to realize that one is dependent upon blind, narcissistic, sociopathic, emotionally illiterate, incompetent and self-destructive grown-ups is to acknowledge that we are depending on the wrong people, which gives the child an undigestible mass of energy that they cannot solve. It would be one thing if there were secure attachments available with groups of healthy adults familiar with the child and with enough maturity to take on the responsibility of raising them, then realizing the moronic incompetence of our parents would be healthy and could lead to a choice that would change the trajectory of our lives. However, in the tenuous state of maturity, where our own parents wish us dead half the time, are busy in a blame game deciding who amongst the marriage is responsible for the fact that children exist in the family and behave the way they do, well, it's very clear they'd get out of that in a minute if they had the chance. So the odds of finding someone with no genetic connection who will take on the honor of parenting the psyche in a new generation is minimal, because the honor is not felt. The shame, the burden, the terror, the guilt, the rage is felt. So, can the high facilitator body be real, authentic, and human, and still be accepted by the children who look to them as parents, as the superhuman parents who will right the wrongs, who will be the parent in a therapeutic or facilitator role that the shame-based children look to for salvation? Well, one of the more humorous aspects of the encounter is the high facilitator inability to admit mistakes, to own impact, to apologize. It's a startling phenomenon until you realize what the public demands of a guru, teacher, therapist, New Age group. You see, the shadow that is created by emotional incompetence and a sociopathic environment is rage, anger, helplessness, shame, guilt, resentment, envy, bitterness. Those are the actual feelings that our cult produces. So what we want in a superhuman New Age guru is someone who lives in the environment that grows those weeds, that lives in the environment that produces those thermometer readings, but that for some reason feels unconditional love, joy, and abundance. And if they can put on an act, they get highly rewarded. And we have our little stereotypes, our little pictures, our little box of what those people are supposed to look like. In 2 words, Deepak Chopra. He's got the mysticism, the unfamiliarity, the remoteness from another culture. He's male, the soft voice, the grandiose vocabulary. I was watching a video of some physicists who were heckling Deepak because Deepak, will say that at the cellular level this will change and this will change. And the microbiologists and physicists were saying, Deepak, do you have any basis for making these specific references to biology and physics at the atomic level? Are you saying you've looked at atoms in a spectrometer and seen the electron do anything different after one of your healings? Or well, Deepak had the good sense to defer and say, well, I may have the terminology wrong. But we like these grandiose things. They cannot be measured. They sound amazing. And they transfer authority to someone in a spiritual position, which is very hard for Deepak's children, because they have to deal with a cell phone addict, with a coffee addict, with someone with ADHD and short attention span who's constantly needing to check his Twitter account and do this and that and the other. And so one of his children did a little documentary about all of Deepak's hypocrisy, which, being a good spiritual teacher, he has to be graceful about. But the point is, there is a prison of demand on the part of children and adolescents that legitimate leaders, that the real stuff, has to do certain things a certain way. Otherwise, they are cut out, because children and adolescents are, by definition, narcissistic and self-absorbed. And they're interested in one thing: can you meet my needs? Can you meet my desires? And if not, I have no time for you. most of us have encountered if we've spent any time at high. A noticeable percentage of relationship partners, including ourselves, that, can you meet this and this specific need that I have? Okay, stop wasting my time. I've wasted my time with you. How could you make me waste my time? I needed this and this and this and this, and you've made me waste my time. Because a child and adolescent is not looking to be of service, is not looking to understand, cannot understand many things. Is not looking to see the other person and be of service. Child and adolescent is desperately trying to get their needs met, having been saddled with the job in many cases of meeting their parents' needs, beginning with the need to look good while being abusive parents. So what do we demand of our community leaders, of our facilitators? What role do we require in order not to reject and turn away? Because these loops are not just one way. It's not just the facilitators promising their eternal commitment to a world in which everyone wins, to transforming ignorance and fear in all ways and all levels, to being the room of love. It's not just the promise that leads to the expectation, to the embodiment of the role of the archetypal ideal parent. It's also the wounded, narcissistic, suspicious, we live in the kind of culture where if one person who is induced into helplessness, despair, rage for years and just left there by sociopathic parents, self-absorbed sociopathic teachers, because once you've been induced into this helpless state of trauma and rage, every single person who is so indoctrinated in their cult that they manage to walk by that beacon of pain, broadcasting out of the victim of enraged and deranged parents, is a sociopath. Because it's not hard to see pain, trauma, panic, and its symptoms. But we make an art form of avoiding those. Well, that leads to a little distrust, a fear of betrayal. And so we have all kinds of little tests that we put on our teachers, and particularly if they want to be called spiritual. It's very interesting to see, what will get respect by an American tourist in India? Who's legit? If they have their penis tied in a knot, or sitting on nails, doing yogic postures 8 hours a day, oh, that's legit. But does that really benefit? If everyone was to stop their job, stop taking care of their children, buy a bunch of nails, cut down some trees to make a board of nails, build a bunch of nail beds and sit there for 8 hours a day, would children grow up knowing their fathers? Would. So what makes something like this legit? You have an Indian voice and a doctor in front of you, of your name, and a nice sound like Chopra. What makes that, I want to buy that book, but I don't want to buy that book? It's just little shortcut memes that children use to decide who has what characteristics. My point is, there's a contract between the high facilitator body and the children and adolescents that enroll in the script. The adolescent contract may be, I'll go along with these exercises as long as I get fucked more. Okay, I get fucked more, so I'll go along with these exercises. The child contract may be, I'll stretch in and be a little bit more honest and pay money and show up at these workshops, but you have to be the superhuman parent who doesn't make mistakes. Institutions have a survival instinct. And because institutions are weak, meaning almost all institutions depend on outdated dogma. They depend on the willingness to tolerate an insane level of bureaucracy. They're not a lot of fun in a number of areas. The more thick and developed the institution is, the less free, the less fun, the less spontaneous it is. So an institution is fragile. And it has to offer a lot of benefit or perceived benefit in order to sustain itself. And so the primary filter of an institution, of those in the institution, considering whether to have someone associated with their institution, is, will you act to suppress and hide all of the things that are flawed about our institution, and will you act to build up the reputation of the institution? If you will not put that as the primary agenda, we don't want you in the institution. Because we are surrounded by children and adolescents, as well as a few adults, that expect these things from the institution. even though the cult produces people for whom those things are very rare. Meaning, the number of American families where the parent has not at times abused their power is what, 1%? The level of time, the number of families where dumb things have been going on and the child asks about it and the parent says, shut up, do it because I said so. 1%? So where are all these perfect facilitators who don't abuse their power and don't say because I said so going to come from? And when the primary basis for elevation and deference to the high facilitator body comes from the superhuman act put on in the workshops, how can you grasp and then grapple with the subhuman act behind the workshops? Narcissism, incompetence, lies, failing to take responsibility for even one's own impact, let alone the whole world winning. And you kind of get those hand in hand because the culture is not supporting the high facilitators to be these superhuman people. You can put on the act for a weekend. But even at a monetary level, the high facilitators do not make a particularly reliable, stable, high income capable of supporting regular professional classes and investments. I mean, certainly they could do a lot more than they have, but there's a message with, can I get into the workshop for less? Can I do this? Can I do this? Oh, I don't have any money. There's a message that is cultural that we don't value human development. We don't value human relationships. I think there's a good question to ask. If the entire high community understood all of the incompetence of the high facilitator body and curriculum, and could pay $600-700 a week or for a weekend, or could pay $1,200 for a weekend for courses that were less sexual, but focused a lot more on practicing the disciplines and the awareness that would lead to a more sustainable and more healthy, loving, and intimate relationship that may or may not involve sex. How many of the high community would choose that? We're not a culture that supports R&D in best practices and science-based protocols for human relationships. We don't want to pay for it. We don't want to pay for it with thinking. We don't want to pay for it with growing up. We don't want to pay for it with money. We don't want to pay for it with time, with discipline, and by gathering the data. 60 lover experiences at all levels of the high organization suggests that many of the women I dated would rather have their hair done for an extra $150 a month than even do a therapy session. The outer is more important than the inner in a chauvinistic cult. The sex is more important than the love or even knowing the definition of love in a chauvinistic cult. It was generally presumed by, I would say, a good chunk of women that I was trying to have sex with them as the number one objective. And they would point out that what I was doing was not a good strategy for me to have sex with them, that what I should be doing is this. But what I was doing was the opposite of the strategy of having sex. I was trying to slow things down to a point where we would have the opportunity to see and be seen in enough detail to where it would be clear whether or not sex was a good idea. This didn't register in a lot of cases. When you have high demands that are unsustainably placed on an organization, I say unsustainably because you cannot place demands on an organization that you could not place on the human beings individually that make up the organization. And if the vast amount of the culture is completely dysfunctional in those areas, it's somewhat irrational to demand that all of the individuals associated with an organization would be the exact opposite of the cult that raised them, and that there would be no shadow to be found. The shadow is the disowned, discarded, taboo part of the cult, of the ego. So if suddenly all these superhuman people are supposed to come out of nowhere in a dysfunctional cult, where is their shadow hidden? Where is the part that has been cast off to play the role of superhuman? And what happens when the shadow is reconnected with the individuals who are disowning it? Well, in a cult of children, the organization falls down because the child is not willing to accept another child as a teacher, as a leader, as someone to make them do weird things. And there's always another person promising to be superhuman, that the child can rush off to and learn their weird rituals and translate the English language into Sanskrit or something else just to make it more mysterious. We couldn't just say peace, we have to say satra or this or that. We can't just say matter, let's turn it into Sanskrit. Changing a word into another language does not change the consciousness of the person uttering the word. If it isn't sacred to you in your language, it's not sacred in another language. It's just a performance. One of the interns told me that she was having trouble becoming an intern. And she said that she talked with every single facilitator privately, and they all said We're rooting for you. We're really going to fight for you in the meeting so that you can be an intern. Every single facilitator. And then the facilitator body met. Suddenly we're not all those individuals anymore. The facilitator body met. And unfortunately, you were not approved as intern. She then subsequently talked with every single facilitator on the facilitator body, who all, I've tried to, hopefully next time. So what does that tell you? A majority of those people are lying. A majority of those people will not tell her what their issue with her is. And they want to be the yes man. They want to be the yes woman and make the institution the problem. The facilitator body does not own sexual abuse by a high facilitator as a high issue. It's a high issue for the whole world to win, but not to stop sexual abuse by its own key staff. The facilitator body cannot talk about any of this publicly. They can spend energy to silence the information, but not to discuss it. Because we're in terrain that the superhuman parent and spiritual leader is diverging from the behavior of the facilitator as individuals and as a group. And my question is, why don't the facilitators go to the people and say, look, we've done 1,000-person surveys. 30 of you said you've been raped in the community. 27% have been re-traumatized. We don't know how to fix all of this, but we want to keep you informed. We want to work at it, and we want to draw on what you know. And we want to hear from books and experts and things, because we're actually committed to you winning in this organization. And we're seeing a lot of symptoms of dis-ease that have nothing to do with love. Healthy intimacy, you see, are not part of a healthy sexuality, but they're part of our group, and they include long-term people who have taken all our courses, and they include ourselves. We've been involved with this trauma. We've been involved, we can't love our own inner child in this area, and we want to invite you as a community to grow up with us, to stop pretending. So the question is, does this cult raise enough adolescents who want to be adults, or enough adults, where that would be a welcome truth and a piece of fresh air and scientific data? Or do we raise children who are so overwhelmed by the responsibility of growing up and taking responsibility, the ability and willingness to respond and learning how to respond competently, that the admission that the teacher, that the leader, that the father, that the mother, that the therapist doesn't actually know what they're doing any more than anyone else, or certainly not perfectly, that this results in all those little children running off to some other guru who promises the ninth wisdom of the seventh heaven as long as you'll buy their book and do this and do that and the other. How long does the majority of our cult need to be children? Because if the condition to being a leader by children is being superhuman and not making mistakes, then you can predictably find the same stupidity and cruelty as exists in the rest of the cult within the high facilitator body, with the one difference that they're very good at putting on a performance and denying that they made any mistake, and covering up and shaming the sexual abuse survivor by not being willing to own it as their inability to respond competently as an adult. Or does it have to be their client who was incompetent and unable to respond? Well, obviously, that's the case. If you're sick and you go to a doctor, it is because you cannot respond to the disease on your own. If you could, you wouldn't be sick and you wouldn't go to a doctor. But if the doctor gives you arsenic instead of vitamin C, or mixes a little bit in, well, of course, you have incompetence on both parties' levels as well. But the question is the high community educated and mature and responsible enough to accept the level of competence in leadership that they are willing to fund? Because it takes time, it takes money to sustain a facilitator body and an organization. And if the community just wants the sex, sociopathic, abusive, or otherwise, it will not fund the capacity and the level of safety, of team, of therapy, of backup that is actually needed to realize the mission. And if it does love itself enough to fund and support that, it will not punish, it will reward facilitators that come forward and say, hey, we don't know what we're doing here, and we're sorry about that. Let's triage, We want to hear from everyone in the community about, and we'll publish all of it on our website, and we'll learn together. And we'll learn fast. It's the Elon Musk style of iteration in public at Boca Chica. You want to see rockets fail and blow up and reiterate and get remade fast, crude, and human? Watch SpaceX's iteration of Starship. There's the courage to be real about what it takes to rapidly create a cost-effective mission to bring this planet into a multi-planetary species, rather than depending 100% on an asteroid not hitting our Earth, which could happen any week. We do not have the asteroid detection devices in place, and we do not have a competent defense strategy for an asteroid the size of a football field to hit the Earth at 16,000 miles an hour, recreate the dinosaur epoch. That can happen tomorrow or next week. Well, one man, Elon, is organizing the resources so that there will be at least a few humans on the moon or on marge in such an event that could reinitiate the life cycle of the planet as far as conscious humans are concerned. And he's doing it very publicly if you watch the step-by-step iterations. The experts applaud him. The children, oh, I would never drive on those spaceships. Look at them blowing up here and falling down here and doing this and doing that. Because he's making the mistakes publicly. When you have a child superhuman parent dynamic in an organization, the organization will perform worse than the average person, will be more abusive than the average person, because their primary agenda is to cover up their secret. But there is a connection between the type of complaining, hypocrisy, and childlike narcissism of the American public, who want to cheat on their own taxes but then point at the president when he cheats at his taxes, who want to leave the hard work to their employees and go and play golf, but complain that the president does that, who lie and have affairs, but don't think that's the right person to lead the country. You know, we are a highly shame-based, highly traumatized, highly emotionally illiterate, highly chauvinistic, schizophrenic, and addicted cult. And the way out of that is to begin gathering the statistical data. It's not with hyperbole. It's not with grandiose promises that have nothing to do with underlying data. It's to gather the data and to show, here's what happens in our group, and here's what happens in this group, with the commitment to be of service. And all the children and all the adolescents will get up in disgust and leave. It's not good enough for them. Data, the chance to respond, hard work, not good enough. They're going to go be spiritual in 30 days for only $10.99. That's what children and adolescents want. And so we get ultimately the leadership that we are willing to create, not the leadership we deserve, and certainly not competent leadership. And that's the responsibility of every leader that agrees to that contract of, as long as I get paid for my incompetency, I'll cover up the mistakes that keep me in my job. And the community that says, well, I'll keep supporting that at low rates. I won't ask too many questions. I won't ask to see the data. I just don't want to pay too much money or take too many risks. And if you'll do that with grandiose promises that sound good to the child and adolescent, then I'll sign up. The one doesn't change without the other. The environment creates the leader, and the leader creates the environment.